Welcome to the Sunday worship service of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Burlington, Vermont. I'm John Sallee, a member of the First UU Worship Associate Team and an aspirant for ordination as a Unitarian Universalist minister. Unitarian Universalists acknowledge that the divine can be called by many names, each insufficient, but approaching fullness when in conversation together. So we are committed to divinity as process and as a presence in our community, regardless of how we each name it. Our meeting house, while mostly virtual for now, and which we humbly acknowledge is physically situated in and built on unceded Abenaki land, serves as a sacred gathering space for the members and friends of this congregation and all who hope for and commit to creating a world of kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity for all beings. You are welcome here, and we are grateful for your participation in this worship. There are a number of ways to get involved at First UU, including coffee hour, which happens from 10:45 until noon every Sunday. At 11, we divide into breakout rooms so everyone gets a chance to interact with a small group. And recognizing that coffee hour should offer flexibility for connecting with one another, the Caring and Belonging team is hosting a new additional coffee hour experience starting today after this service. These coffee hour circles, which are planned for the next 4 weeks, will be a slightly more structured hour of shared reflection on the service. So make sure to get there in time to get placed in the correct breakout room and let us know what you think. To learn more about our faith, our meeting house, and our society and its activities, you can click the link in YouTube or explore our website, uusociety.org. Let us know you're visiting. We welcome the opportunity to welcome you personally.
We kindle this chalice flame to remind ourselves of the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment. The call to worship today is from the work of the Reverends Marjorie Bowens-Wheatley and Clyde Grubbs. This is part of a prayer that they wrote, they called History's Road. The road of history is long, full of both hope and disappointment. We have become a global village with a growing realization of how fragile this earth is, how interconnected we are to each other and to all creation. We cannot continue to live in the old way. We must make a change, see a new way, a way toward peace with justice and a healthy planet. Where are we to find the courage to begin this work? We know that a different tomorrow is possible, but how can we build it? We think of the prophets, women and men, who voiced unpopular opinions, who made personal sacrifices and sometimes lost their lives for the sake of justice. Who are the prophets who inspire you? May they join a great cloud of witnesses to a new way of life, the way of peace and justice, the way of justice lived according to the way of peace, the beloved community.
Good morning. Harriet Tubman is certainly one of the more familiar names in Black history. And yet, each time I hear her story, I'm just blown away by the strength of this woman. A child born into slavery and all its cruelties, who nonetheless grows up to be an adult of unrivaled bravery, ingenuity, and perseverance. While I remember learning in school about Harriet Tubman as the conductor on the Underground Railroad, who escaped slavery herself only to return again and again to lead others to their freedom. but less attention is paid to her other roles as a nurse in the Union Army, as a spy behind Confederate lines, as the first woman to ever lead a U.S. military raid, a raid up the Combahee River that freed 700 people in 2 days. The story I'm going to read today was written by Lesa Cline-Ransome and illustrated by her husband, James Ransome. This is them. Before She Was Harriet is a poem, really, that travels backwards through Harriet Tubman's life, starting and ending with her as an old woman sitting on an actual train, as opposed to the figurative Underground Railroad, which she conducted in the dark of night.
Before She Was Harriet by Lesa Cline-Ransome, illustrated by James E. Ransome, published by Holiday House. Here she sits, an old woman, tired and worn, her legs stiff, her back achy. But before wrinkles formed and her eyes failed, before she reached her twilight years, she could walk for miles and see clearly under a sky lit only with stars. Before she was an old woman, she was a suffragist, a voice for women who had none in marriages, in courts, in voting booths. Before her voice became soft and raspy, it was loud and angry, rising above injustice. Before she was a suffragist, she was General Tubman, riding out of the fog armed with courage, strong in the face of rebels and planters and overseers, as they watched fields burn and bridges fall and 700 slaves stop chopping and start running to a woman who ferried them to freedom on the Combahee River turned River Jordan. Before she was General Tubman, she was a spy, carrying secrets across battlefields to soldiers fighting in the Civil War for President Lincoln to end slavery. Before she was a Union spy, she was a nurse, caring for those hit with bullets and hatred and fear, tending to them with bandages and words in the bloodied dirt of Southern soil. Before she was a nurse, she was Aunt Harriet, daughter of Ben and Rit, who helped her parents flee their master and find their way through woods and streams to the safety of Canada and a new home in the North. Before she was Aunt Harriet, she was Moses, a conductor on an underground railroad with no trains and no tracks, just passengers traveling to freedom, up north, through swamps, past slave catchers, across rivers, under the cover of night. Seeking the promised land for her people, led by dreams and God and faith, a wisp of a woman with the courage of a lion. Before she was Moses, she was Minty of Maryland, of one slave owner and then others, who worked her, punished her with lashes, broke her back, but not her spirit. Before she was Minty, she was Araminta, a young girl taught by her father to read the woods and the stars at night, readying for the day that she would leave behind slavery along with her name and pick a new one, Harriet, and remember her days as a suffragist, as a general, as a spy, as a nurse, as Aunt Harriet, as Moses, as a conductor, as Minty, as Araminta, who dreamed of living long enough to one day be old, stiff and achy, tired and worn and wrinkled, and free.
Having entered worship, we once again center our intentions to offer and lay bare our joys and sorrows on the altar of divine community. Relief and joy for the release of asylum seeker Pastor Stephen Tendo from a detention center in Texas. Stephen was severely tortured in Uganda after letting people know they had the right to vote. He just was beginning his 3rd year in detention in Texas, where his health was greatly affected. He's now with his sponsor in Texas, awaiting his asylum appeal with the 5th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals. Members of our UU Immigration Justice team advocated for him and sent many cards of support to Stephen, for which he is so grateful. Not all joys and sorrows can be confined by words. Fewer can be spoken, and fewer still spoken publicly here. In the silence that follows before our next hymn, please join me in holding those offered, spoken and unspoken, known and unknown, in our collective and meditative embrace. May the joys and sorrows of each be the joys and sorrows of all, reminding us of our shared humanity.
In the state of Alabama, during the early 60s and the mid-60s, there were several 100,000 of black people of voting age, but very few were registered to vote. As a matter of fact, in the heart of the Black Belt, in Selma, a small town in Alabama, that had only about 2.1% of the black people of voting age registered in 1965. Today in Selma, more than 70% of the blacks of voting age are registered to vote, and 5 members of a 10-member city council happen to be black. In Greene County, Alabama, during the early 60s, very few blacks were registered, but today that county is controlled by blacks. The highest elected official of the county is a young man, Thomas Gilmore, who is the sheriff.
Stand up and make good trouble. Speak up and make good trouble. Get up and make good trouble. Rise up and make good trouble. Stand up and make good trouble. Speak up and make good trouble. Get up and make good trouble. Rise up and make good trouble. Stand up and make good trouble. Speak up and make good trouble. Get up and make good trouble. Rise up and make good trouble. Never be afraid to make some noise. Make some noise. Never be afraid to make some noise. Make some noise.
This is the struggle of a lifetime.
Make some noise.
Makes good trouble. This is the struggle of a lifetime. And make good trouble. This is the struggle of a lifetime. And make good trouble. This is the struggle of a lifetime. And make good trouble.
So you tell us to wait. You tell us to be patient. We cannot wait. We cannot be patient. We want our freedom and we want it now.
I love narrative and its role in constructing history. It can be arbitrary, absurd, and even counterproductive at times, but also so meaningful. Stories make facts into experiences. They can make all those separate parts seem connected to each other and to their contexts. The thing about stories, though, and experiences for that matter, is that they are limited. When I was young, the evangelical Christian church that my family attended spent a lot of time talking about other faiths and the danger of being swayed by them, being led down the wrong path. One of those faiths that I was warned against was the Unitarian Universalists. They were a well-meaning but deluded group that worshiped nature, good feelings, and possibly worst of all, the evil of pluralism. Clearly, that story didn't stick. I am now both Unitarian Universalist and pluralist. I had been told about UUs as well as other faiths, but that narrative was limited and incomplete. I figured out how limited that telling was because I learned about other faiths and the people who believed and practiced them, and about people who did not care much for faith at all. And so many of them found richness and meaning in their lives and showed goodness in their actions. I decided to leave that church and their one-sided stories behind. I studied and visited different traditions, congregations, and temples, and after several years landed in a Unitarian Universalist meeting house, where I settled into a new faith tradition and a new, comfortably pluralistic community. But I also kind of looked down on my old church. I felt like the tradition I had come from was diluted. They told one-sided stories, especially about UUism and all the other faiths that I had come to appreciate deeply. I spent a long time thinking that, time in which I've met a lot of good people, people who have become friends, some I even consider family, people who found richness and meaning in their lives and showed goodness in their actions, and who quite possibly would feel at home in that same church I left. And most recently, I've been taught about and mentored in religious pluralism by a group of people with considerable representation from evangelical Christianity, none of whom I would consider deluded or anything less than good people dedicated to service. To every story, there are countless connections that might feature only briefly or on the periphery, or sometimes wholly outside of the telling, because stories are limited, like experience. But they get retold, revised, renewed, and along the way, so do their elements and characters get recast as minor or major, hero or villain, object or subject. Just like there was more to the first narrative I heard about Unitarian Universalism and the church in which I was raised, there was more to the second, and there will be more still. Whether or not they were told as if complete, they were limited. It is up to me to listen and know that there is more.
Every week, we pause in our worship service to take up a collection as one of the ways of remembering that this congregation exists because of the generosity and vision and hope and commitment of a bunch of people, you and others. The collection supports the work of the congregation in the community and also supports the organizations in the community that are doing the work that our values and principles tell us matters so much. And today, this week's collection will be shared with the Vermont Diversity Health Project, which exists to improve the health and wellness of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Vermonters by building relationships, bridges between healthcare providers and LGBTQ Vermonters around the state. That matters. Your gifts matter. Thank you for your generous gifts, which will now be most gratefully received.
Please join me in these unison words of dedication. With gratitude, we dedicate these gifts in the service of our mission to inspire spiritual growth, to care for each other and our community, seek truth, and act for justice.
It was in seminary that I developed the generally not good habit of reading parts of books rather than the whole book start to finish. At that point, it was a necessity. I had to finish papers. I had exams I needed to pass. But I will admit to you that this habit has continued. When I need a quote or a citation or an idea for a sermon, I'll look it up in the index of a book, read a few pages or a chapter at most, get what I need, mark it with Post-it notes, and put it in the pile of books that's waiting for me to finish them when I have time. Really. Here's one current stack in my study. I really will get back to them all soon. It struck me as I pondered what to talk about on this Black History Sunday that the practice of telling little parts of the story is a somewhat accurate way of describing how I and maybe lots of white people have approached the massive, complicated, infuriating, disturbing history of Black people and white people in America. It's February. Do a Google search, look in an index, find a story or part of a story, maybe that people haven't already heard, maybe read one whole book, and then we're done. As a well-intentioned white person, I'm done till next year. I hope you will agree with me when I say that, well-intentioned as that kind of dabbling may be, it is not enough. Not now. Not with the enormous challenges of division and inequity that we face in our country, in our time. I think the work that lots of us are talking about includes making the whole of this country's history visible for us to talk about and think about, including the parts of that history that we weren't supposed to know. We need to be curious. We need to talk to each other. We need especially to listen. Action comes from learning, and action is needed, God knows, but there's a lot we need to learn that nobody taught us before. And now there are so many ways to learn those hidden bits. I feel these days like I'm swimming in a fabulous growing variety of resources, and I want to give you a heads up. I'm going to make a list of some of the resources that I know about and put it on the Society's website, and I very much would love to include your suggestions and additions too. So you can start making notes now. I'll remind you later. What are these resources? They're books and TED Talks and documentaries and movies. Peter and I, the other night, watched One Night in Miami. It's extraordinary. History I didn't know I didn't know. And then, and for me especially, there are podcasts. I will tell you about just two of my favorites, both of them NPR podcasts. One is Throughline, which is a history podcast, and their description starts with, "The past is never past. Every headline has a history." Recent episodes of Throughline have talked about the importance of Whitney Houston singing the national anthem at the Super Bowl 30 years ago. I didn't understand that as an important historic event. I should have. There was a whole lot I didn't know about Marcus Garvey, and I listened to that episode of Throughline as well. And this week's that I haven't heard yet is about the African-American science fiction, many award-winning author Octavia Butler. And then there's Code Switch. I've actually wondered whether just assigning a white person, the job of just listening to Code Switch podcasts from the beginning would be a whole education. We're probably not going to do that. Their tagline is fearless conversations about race that you've been waiting for. And a recent episode of that has talks about the historical fiction, the romance historical fiction books, many of them that have been written in this country and widely read by, not me, that star Black people, and especially Black women in history. I'm definitely going to check that one out. We never know all the parts of a story, not even of our own, but we can search out more about the real lives of real people, our fellow American citizens and fellow immigrants. We can resist the temptation when it comes up, which it does all the time, the temptation to reduce any person to one thing, one attitude, one success, one failure. Today, to get us going maybe, I'm going to tell you 3 short stories about 3 fascinating people that I've been lucky enough to learn about in this surprising work of ministry that I've done for some years now. Just snippets of stories. And I have the not hidden agenda of enticing you to search out more. The first person I want to talk about is Booker T. Washington. I knew, and you know, that in his day, Booker T. Washington, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, was one of the most famous men in the United States. He was certainly the most well-known African American. I knew, and you probably know, that he was a controversial figure, that he disagreed in philosophy and strategy with other Black leaders, especially, but not limited to, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others in the North who he felt could not understand what it was like to be a Black person in the South, especially a Black person who had been enslaved and was suddenly freed. I didn't know much more than that until we moved to Charleston, West Virginia. I didn't know that that part of West Virginia claims Booker T. Washington as a native son, sort of. The truth is, Booker was born into slavery on a plantation in Virginia in 1856. We don't know who his father was. We know that his mother, Jane, was a cook on the plantation. We know that his stepfather, a man named Washington Ferguson, had gone west during the war, and found work, paid work, at the salt furnaces in the new state of West Virginia. After emancipation, Jane and Booker, who was then 9, and his 2 younger siblings, walked 200 miles over the mountains to get to West Virginia. I don't know how many of you have ever flown over West Virginia, but if you have, you might notice that there are lots of mountains and there aren't very many flat parts. So this 200-mile trip was really extraordinary, including if you've ever done whitewater rafting or some really, really exciting mountaineering work. You've perhaps seen the New River Gorge. Imagine Jane and their wagon and Booker and the 2 younger kids climbing down the side of the New River Gorge and crossing the river and up the other side. It's actually a little hard for me to imagine, but that's what they did. They made it to West Virginia, to a little town called Malden, and Booker did not like it there. There were too many people, everything was too close together. He missed the farm he had grown up on. And he didn't like the work of freedom. He had to help his father in the salt furnaces, which was nasty, hard, long hours of work. And his stepfather kept all of Booker's pay too. Booker wanted desperately to go to school. His stepfather would not let him. And finally, after much pleading, Ferguson, the stepdad, said that Booker could go if he first worked at the salt furnace from 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. in the morning, and then if he came after school to work another 2 hours. Getting to school on time was a problem, however, because quitting time at the salt furnace was 9 o'clock and the school opening was also at 9 o'clock and the school was a mile away. Booker had no way to get to school on time, so he came up with a clever solution, which worked for a while. He got to the salt furnace early and moved the clock. He changed the clock by a good number of minutes, and for a number of weeks, the 100 or more employees of the furnace just thought the shift was ending early, and Booker had time to get to school. This part of the story I want you to know about is the part that happened when Booker had a chance to leave this work in the salt furnace and go to work as a kind of a houseboy to a woman named Viola Ruffner. She was a school teacher. She was a Vermonter, and she had come to West Virginia to marry General Lewis Ruffner, who was 20 years older than she and who had a whole bunch of kids who didn't like Viola at all. She had all this energy. She needed a project, and Booker turned out to be that project. She was his teacher in more ways than one. She gave him many books. She encouraged him to study, and he credited her in his later life with instilling in him the ethic of hard work and cleanliness and thrift on which his social philosophy, his whole philosophy, was based. Booker grew up, he went to college, he became head of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and he called for Black progress through education and entrepreneurship. He put together a nationwide coalition of middle-class Black people and church leaders and white philanthropists and politicians, with the goal of building Black people's economic strength and pride through self-help and schooling. There's another thing I didn't know about Booker T. Washington, and that is that his alliances with those rich white men, those businessmen and philanthropists, were a little more complex than was publicly known. Some of those very wealthy white men who'd made their wealth in the oil industry, for example, were actually secretly financing the court cases that Booker T. Washington and others were bringing to force our country to provide education for Black children, to Black girls and Black boys. The money for those court cases was coming in part from rich white people, including some who were Unitarians. The second person I want to talk about is Howard Thurman. I didn't know much about him before I went to seminary. I might have known that he was an African-American theologian and that he was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. I don't think I realized that he was also a proponent of nonviolence. He was born in 1899 in Ohio to a poor family. At least one of his parents had been enslaved. In 1925, he was ordained as a Baptist minister, and he also, in the early years of his ministry, studied with a pacifist Quaker. In 1953, he came to Boston University. This is the job that he's known for. He was the first Black dean at a mostly white American university. He overlapped there with Martin Luther King Jr. for just a year as King was finishing his graduate studies. Howard Thurman preached what he called a philosophy of common ground. He believed that humans need inner spiritual happiness, and that leads us to share our experience in community with others. He has very serious credentials as a theologian. His works are dense and sometimes mystical and challenging to read. He was not known for public activism. He believed that the first order of social change was changing one's own internal spirit. I knew, and you probably knew, that Martin Luther King was very influenced in the development of his own nonviolence philosophy by the work of Gandhi in India and the work of the movement that he built, the nonviolent movement to liberate the Indian people from their British colonial rulers. I didn't know that King learned about all of this in part from Howard Thurman at Boston University. It turns out that decades earlier, in 1935, while Thurman was dean at Howard University, he took a group of students to India. The idea was to have some Indian students have some exposure to some Black American Christians. They met Gandhi. He was a small man, elderly, rather unimpressive, Howard Thurman thought. And then, in their conversation, Gandhi began to press Thurman. He asked, why are Blacks in the United States so committed to Christianity? It seemed, Gandhi said, that Christian religion was being used as a tool by white people to keep Blacks in place. He wondered if Christianity lacked the spiritual strength to be the backbone of a Black American liberation movement. Hindu principles, he said, had offered a basis for nonviolent opposition to British power, but did Christianity have a similar strength to fuel an uprising of American Blacks? Thurman wrote about this later as a moment of revelation for him. He knew Gandhi was right. He certainly had experienced racism directly. He had watched as Christian churches did little to condemn it and nothing to bring Blacks and whites together, even in the pews. Howard Thurman returned from India to the United States. He decided not to turn away from Christianity, but to change it into the faith that it could be and had never been in the United States. Here's some of what Thurman wrote. We saw what we must do. We knew that we must test whether a religious fellowship could be developed that was capable of cutting across all racial barriers with a carryover into the common life, a fellowship that would alter the behavior patterns of those involved. It became imperative now to find out if experiences of spiritual unity among people could be more compelling than the experiences that divide them. And so, the civil rights movement was born. The last person I want to talk to you about is Ysaye Barnwell. She's a musician, a composer, a singer. She is still very much alive and at work in this country and also in Unitarian Universalism. You might well have known her as one of the founders of Sweet Honey in the Rock, the a cappella group of Black women who have been singing for well over 35 years now. 34 of those years, Issei Barnwell was involved with them. You maybe have heard them or seen them at General Assembly or other workshops. If you have been in a workshop with Issei Barnwell, as Peter and I were lucky enough to be, you're very lucky. And you know that it was a transformative experience, which is exactly her point. Here's some of what Issei Barnwell says about her work. There is an awesome power in the human voice. And when uncommon voices are blended for a shared goal, like children playing or marchers singing at demonstrations, we become a community of individuals absorbed in a shared communal experience. Technology now is changing some fundamental aspects of how, when, where, and why we communicate as human beings, but our voices, blended in song, articulate shared goals and causes, ideologies, passions and beliefs, faiths, work, rituals. They tell our collective stories. Our blended voices are the core of our humanity, she writes. Try it, you'll love it, she says. And my response is soon, soon. I hope soon. Ysaye Barnwell has been studying music since she was 2.5 and started playing the violin, but she also has degrees in speech pathology and public health and a bunch of honorary doctorates, including one from Meadville Lombard Theological School, which is one of our 2 Unitarian Universalist seminaries. She taught at the Howard University College of Dentistry for over a decade. She administered public health programs in hospitals and agencies in DC. She's a composer, an author, an actress. For 34 years, as I said, she was in Sweet Honey in the Rock, and before that, some years before that, in 1977 to be exact, she founded the Jubilee Singers, which is a choir which is part of the All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in Washington, D.C. Wouldn't you have loved to have been the minister there when she made an appointment to say, you know, I think we need a new choir here? In, I think it was 2003, General Assembly happened in Boston. Peter and I were there, so were 600 at least other religious professionals, ministers and religious educators and church musicians and administrators. And there was a program that Issei Barnwell led. We were there, 600 of us. We didn't have any music. We weren't in sections. We were just there in this room with folding chairs. And Issei Barnwell said, we're gonna sing. I was a little doubtful. She said, we're gonna sing in harmony, and you're gonna sound great. And I was a little doubtful. But she, in her petiteness and her clear direction, she led us into a musical experience, the likes of which I'm not sure I had ever had before. And we did indeed sound wonderful, and we did sing in harmony. It's an experience I wish for everybody. You too. We are fortunate in some ways in these days of pandemic isolation. We're fortunate in one way because our congregations are experimenting now with ways of sharing resources now that we're doing these online services, especially worship resources and especially musical resources for worship, which is why Lea Morris, whose music you've seen now in several of our services, she's a musician also in Washington, D.C. She works with the choir at the Washington Ethical Society and with people all over the country. A couple of weeks ago, we had a beautiful piece sung by Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout, who's the director of worship and music at the Ann Arbor, Michigan UU Church. And in a minute, you'll get to hear and see Issei Barnwell and more than 100 other voices. I think Woody Fulton was one of those voices in the GA choir just last year, virtually in 2020. Before we do that, though, I want to remind you of your assignment, which is to learn more about Black history, and in so doing, learn about your own. There are opportunities right now in this congregation that the racial justice team is making possible, groups and study, and they're all important, and you can do one of those. I hope you'll think about it if you can. But in between, before and after, you can do your own search. You can go online. You can Google Issei Barnwell and get to hear and see her speak and talk. You can find your podcast, your book, your movie that has changed your life and taught you something. I hope you do, and I hope that when you do, you'll send me an email because I'm going to put your resource on our list and we'll publish it. We can do this together.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. Oh, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers lovers of life and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth, keepers of faith, makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, and the builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are one. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings, and we are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of forgiveness. These we carry in our hearts and share with the world until we are together again. Our words of benediction today are from the amazing Bryan Stevenson, the founder and director of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. If you don't already know everything about, or some things about Bryan Stevenson, I hope that you will look him up as well. When he ends a talk, Bryan Stevenson almost always reminds us of his 4 rules for achieving peace and justice. Number 1 is get proximate. Get close to the marginalized. Number 2, change the narrative from one of fear and anger to one of hope and creativity. Number 3 is to stay hopeful about creating justice, even when it's complicated. And number 4, we need to be willing to do uncomfortable things. So may it be. Go in peace.